another amazing crowd for another much anticipated event here at the AVA Gallery and Art Center. Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth and last of the Sunday afternoon programs here at AVA this January, offered in connection with the Smithsonian Institution's traveling exhibition, The Way We Worked, which ends its guest appearance at AVA today and will be on its way to Maine next week. I'm Bente Torjussen, Executive Director of AVA, and while I am delighted to have the privilege of introducing our distinguished speaker, Professor of Anthropology Robert Welsch, a well-known scholar and a long-time friend and supporter of AVA, I also feel a tinge of sadness that we have come to the conclusion of this wonderful series of programs. But I promise you that this year, which is AVA's 40th anniversary year, will continue to be packed with all sorts of programs, albeit of a very different nature. And although the Smithsonian exhibition will travel on, we will continue to display the photographs from the Carter factory throughout our building. And we will also regularly be showing the wonderful documentary film that premiered here 2 weeks ago, titled Connecting the Threads, Overall to Art, H.W. Carter and Sons Factory. I would also like to remind you that a companion exhibition, The Way We Work, will be on display in our 2 adjacent galleries through February 1st. It showcases work by artists who have studios in this former factory building today, and it is reassuring to know that the creative spirit and busy hands will continue to be hard at work in this building for the foreseeable future. Before I go in further detail about Professor Welsch's impressive credentials, I would like to briefly acknowledge institutions, organizations, businesses, and individuals who have worked together to make these exhibitions and all the related programs possible. The exhibition, The Way We Worked, an exhibition created by the National Archives, is part of what is called Museum on Main Street, which is a collaboration between the Smithsonian Institution and local humanities council throughout the United States. Historic New England, an organization headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts, was asked by the Smithsonian to be responsible for organizing shows of the way we worked throughout New England. So Historic New England then contacted New Hampshire Humanities Council, asking that they find 3 appropriate sites for the exhibition in New Hampshire. The Humanities Council's program director contacted AVA, knowing that we were located in a building that formerly was a work clothes factory, and thus an ideal site for an exhibition of this nature. The New Hampshire Humanities Council, Historic New England, and AVA subsequently began to explore ways in which the Smithsonian exhibition could be augmented with displays and special programs focusing on local work history. And the result is this intriguing series of Sunday afternoon programs at AVA, as well as our own exhibition on local work history that accompanies the Smithsonian presentation. I wish to thank Mascoma Savings Bank, whose generous support enabled us to offer such a comprehensive series of events in connection with the way we work. And a very special thank you is due to the many members of Lebanon Historical Society, and many of you are here today. A very special thank in particular to the curator Ed Ashe. All of you have generously provided us with a large number of items for display. I also wish to acknowledge the photographer Jack Rowell, whose work is on display here, featuring with photographs of former factory workers and relatives of owners and manager of the factory. A big thank you goes to all of you who have attended this series, not the least to regulars, like former factory worker Eugene Dauphiné and his wife Anne-Marie, who have been present at every program offered here in January, and who last night donned their blue jeans and danced around right in this very space. A sight to remember. Another thank you goes to AVA staff, board, volunteers, and interns, and most specifically to AVA's exhibition coordinator, Margaret Jacobs. None of this would have happened without her dedication and hard work. In his lecture this afternoon, Professor Welsch will focus on the mill buildings and the industrial entrepreneurs in Lebanon since the Civil War. While Robert is a noted scholar on the cultures of faraway societies, he has written volumes on the art and society of the Papuan Gulf of New Guinea, for example. He is also uniquely qualified to talk about local history and culture. Robert holds a BA in anthropology from Northwestern University and an MA in anthropology from the University of Washington, where he also received his doctoral degree. He is a recipient of numerous academic honors and awards and has served on panels for the National Endowment for the Humanities as well as for the National Science Foundation. From 1984 to 2008, he was a visiting professor at the Department of Anthropology at Dartmouth College. And during that time, he was a frequent guest curator at the Hood Museum. Currently professor of anthropology at Franklin Pierce University, he also continues his decades-long involvement with the Field Museum in Chicago as adjunct curator of the Department of Anthropology. Locally, he has been a member of Lebanon's Historical Society since 2000, where he also served as their curator for several years. Since 2005, he has been the chair of Lebanon's Heritage Commission and a member of the Soldiers Memorial Buildings Advisory Board. He has written a number of articles on the history of Lebanon for the Valley News, several of them focusing on Lebanon's Civil War veterans and the Soldiers Memorial Building. He also served as advisor and consultant to Historic New England for the making of the Carter documentary, which was co-produced with CITV and AVA. While his resume is 23 pages long, single-spaced, I think this suffices to give you an idea of Robert's impressive academic credential, as well as his deep involvement with local history and with AVA. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Welsch. There's the water. Yes.
Can we turn the lights on?
We can.
Can you all hear me if I don't use the microphone?
Absolutely.
In the back?
I can.
You can? Okay, raise your hand if you're having problems and we can always use the microphone. I've entitled this talk, The Mill Buildings of Lebanon, Exploring the Entrepreneurial Spirit of Lebanon. But I sort of have another idea in mind that I really thought of as another possible title, Mills, Entrepreneurs, and Fires. An interpretation of Lebanon's commercial history. And I really think the entrepreneurial spirit of Lebanon, you see it very, very clearly with its various commercial enterprises. And I think the most visible part of that is actually the mill buildings, because they are a tangible place. So I'm hoping I've kind of broken the talk down into three different areas. I want to talk about the early history of Lebanon, which actually starts over by the Connecticut River, but quickly shifts over to East Lebanon. And I'm suspecting that most of you don't know much about East Lebanon. And then, after 1840, it shifts to the central village, here where we are now. And of course, the central theme running through Lebanon in the early days was the Mascoma River. And that generated all this water power throughout the town. And it was central, yeah.
We can't see.
Oh, sorry.
You can move to it. Yeah, thank you.
Let me try this. Is that better?
Better.
Okay. Okay. I also want to say at this juncture, since I've broken my train of thought a bit, I'm going to use a lot of images, largely from Robert Levitt's New Hampshire in Pictures, or Lebanon, New Hampshire in Pictures, and also some from Roger Carroll's book on the history of Lebanon. And then I've got a collection of postcards that I've scanned, and this is one of them. So you're going to see bits and pieces from all those sources, and they're not mostly identified. In a few cases, toward the end of the talk, you'll see some of my own photographs or colleagues, but largely those are the sources. As I was saying, what runs through the history of Lebanon and also through the town of Lebanon is the Mascoma River. And it's the mill power that was generated by the water that actually gives Lebanon its powerful boost on its economic activities. And we're going to explore some of that today. Of course, later, after the 1850s, railroad traffic becomes really important to the city. And it links all three villages. There was a railroad stop at East Lebanon. There was one here downtown in Central Village, and then in West Lebanon. They had to change the name in West Lebanon because people got Lebanon and West Lebanon confused, so that became Westboro. And the one over in East Lebanon became Mascoma. So those were the three villages that were identified. But the mills played a really active role from the very beginning in the history of Lebanon. Now, the earliest settlement was, of course, along the Connecticut River. How many of you know where the Dana House is? Yeah? Well, it used to be over on South Main Street, where there's a really big willow tree hanging over the street. Well, that was where the site of the original house was. It's been moved up to next to Seminary Hill School. But it used to be there. And that's where Jonathan Dana was, probably from 1765 onward. And he, on his plot of 100 acres, was one of the first sawmills in the town. And that was over along the Connecticut, near the Connecticut River on the Mascoma. But very quickly after settlement, people started settling inland. And here's a map from 1767. And I want to point out, this is the West Lebanon area, this is the Central Village over here, and East Lebanon is over there. What this shows is some of the roads here. See, all the roads are built over on the west side of town. But that changes fairly quickly, and they moved to cover the whole town. And then there was just much better water power over in East Lebanon, and everything shifted over there. So the sawmills were really important in West Lebanon. More recently, the power sources, the river was a source for power. I never like to give a talk where I'm going to talk about the Central Village or East Lebanon without giving at least a shout out to West Lebanon. Because I want everybody to know we haven't forgotten about West Lebanon. But historically, it wasn't as important in terms of the mill story as the east and central part of town. The population by 1800 has shifted. This is probably around 1910. And you can see the settlement over here is very, very small. Central Village is already a little bit, but the real concentration is over here in East Lebanon. And it was the commercial center of town at the time. Had a much larger population at that time than Central Village. And Roger Carroll suggests if you had asked the Lebanon residents in 1835 to forecast the town's economic center in 1885, most probably would have chosen East Lebanon, which supported the town's largest array of merchants and manufacturers. And that was certainly true. This is much later, but this is right around the lake, the bottom of the lake in the late 19th century. One of the leading citizens and one of the wealthiest citizens in East Lebanon, and certainly in Lebanon, was Elijah Payne. He came up from Connecticut. He was at Yale University. The proprietors of the town brought him up, and they gave him several parcels of land as long as he would build a mill. And so mills are the attractive thing for them. Everybody wants the mills. And his enterprises were very much the center of economic activity until the 1840s. He had died in 1807, but his properties were still productive. There's the East Lebanon Cemetery where he's buried. He was a representative in New Hampshire's legislature and very much involved with local politics. He declined to serve in the Continental Congress, but he was involved very much in trying to get the state to ratify the Constitution. He was also, interestingly enough, the first lieutenant governor of Vermont. And he didn't move. He stayed in East Lebanon. But it was East Lebanon and Vermont then when there was a secession movement to form Vermont. And all the towns along the river were going with Vermont because they were fighting with people at Portsmouth. Anyway, does that sound familiar? Anyway, he built at least 2 mills on the river, and his mills were primarily sawmills, which were very much needed at the time. This is the dam at the foot of Lake Mascoma, about 1888. There's the dam, more or less today. Well, this was taken in the summer, obviously. There are 2 other figures that I think are really quite important. These Scottish guys that came up here, James Ralston and Thomas Rea, they set up a carding and fulling mill, and it was the first carding mill in the United States was set up in East Lebanon. They also opened stores, and Ralston was the first postmaster in town. Rea went over to what's now the Miracle Mile to set up another factory over there. But Ralston's efforts continued to prosper. And here we see the effect of economic stimulus. When you start having a productive enterprise, it brings in money, and then that money circulates around, and then it spreads to other businesses. And that's what you see all over Lebanon. When there's a basic source of income, then it seems to prosper, and all kinds of little businesses grow up around it. So there was a blacksmith shop, a wagon and wheel shop, and a tailor shop, and then the cloth works continued for a while after that. Josiah Barnes had a store. Halsey Stevens had a store that was biggest in Lebanon at the time. Stevens was also the postmaster. He was also a wool buyer for the Middlesex Manufacturing Company of Lowell, Mass., which gives you a sense that they were all connected, much more than we tend to think about today. There were other mills. Aldrich had a grist mill near Payne's sawmill. Jesse Cook ran a sawmill. Josiah Barnes had an interest in the sawmill and grist mills in the village. And eventually in 1838, the legislature incorporated the Mascoma Manufacturing Company for the manufacture of cotton and woolen goods, cotton yarns. And then February 1840 happened. And one evening, a fire broke out and destroyed almost everything in East Lebanon. All in one fell swoop. Thus my mills, entrepreneurs, and fires. And of course it changes the history. Most of these guys started to rebuild right afterwards, but it was clear this wasn't the most productive place if you don't have the productive industries around it. And so little by little people started moving away to Central Village. And so we go on to the next side of the story. But there were a couple of exceptions. William Haskell, who lived in Massachusetts, he purchased some of the mills that Elijah Payne had started. And he was starting around 1853. And he continued to run those mills, although he never lived here. His son did. And his mill was used to manufacture school furniture, desks and that sort of thing. And it was productive for about 20, 25 years. And then it actually peters out. This is from the famous 1860s map. And the lake would be over here, close to there at the time. And here's the sawmill, Haskell's sawmill, and school factory, school furniture factory. And we're going to come back to, for the end of the talk, to a mill that's down about here, just off the map. It wasn't started in 1860. But after this, even with this town mostly, the village mostly gone, Haskell had 15 men employed in 1860, and he had 40 saws, planes, and groovers, hired more than 40 people in 1870. But then the business changed and it closed in 77. So even then, but this is the last effort of East Lebanon's heyday. By 1860, Central Village has gotten a lot bigger. East Village is starting to peter out. West Lebanon is starting to concentrate its activities, but it's not around the mills, and you'll notice that there's no mill power where they're located. So here's downtown Lebanon, Central Village, in 1860. And we're here in, right about here, the building hasn't been built yet. There's the Carter House, here's the green. And of course, all the activity we're going to talk about is mostly centered around this, where the mills are. There were 8 or 9 dams along this stretch. There were more than 25 dams from Mascoma River down to the Connecticut River. And each of them had their work to do. So, but here's where the busy activity was. Now we'll come back to some of this in a minute. Here's a directory of manufacturers in Lebanon, downtown. This actually includes Sideville, which I'll come back to. But you can see, it's not a very big list of manufacturers. But the big one is this one here, M&J Buck and Company. And they were located right along the river on High Street. And they had 14 or 15 buildings, factory buildings, on the river and on High Street and above High Street. And that's where their center of operations was. It was clearly the biggest employer in town. And they got started in 1849, I think. They employed between 100 and 150 men. They largely made machines for woodworking, and we've got an example here from the Lebanon Historical Society. Dave LaBelle and I went to fetch it from a donor in Massachusetts a few years ago, and I'm pleased to say that Ed Ashley has been able to get it up and working again, to at least to show everybody what it does. It's a teniner. It makes tenons. I didn't know what a tenon was. I'd never done any woodworking, but it's when you have the grooves in for drawers and things like that. The tenon is the thing that goes in the hole.
Yeah, the metal one.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's what they did. This is one of their parts of their factories in 1855. This is from a postcard. This is, I think, this very piece of equipment here. That's where they make the tenons. That's the hard work. But then there's a wooden frame around it. But they made tools to make things with, make wooden things with. Martin Buck, he and his brother ran the business together for a number of years, and then the brother decided to go back into farming, and Martin Buck carried on for a while. They lived in the Buck residence over on High Street. Many of you from town will know this building over on High Street. It's the duplex. This is the Ami Burnham Young building over on High Street. He's a famous architect from town. Now, this is a close-up of this shot. You can see most of these buildings around this area were owned by Buck and Company. So this area was really where they were working. Some of the other companies were working down here. There's a tannery down here, for example. and his stables and whatnot, all kinds of things happening. This is the business directory from the same 1860 map. And you can see there's a number of businesses here. It's a little bit bigger than what we had as a list of things from the 1830s in East Lebanon. There really wasn't that much going on. By 1870, I've gone through the New Hampshire business directory, and you have to go business by business throughout the whole, alphabetically by business, and Lebanon is in there amongst Plainfield and all the other towns. And so I've gone through there page by page to find everything that's Lebanon. And my typescript of that goes on for 8 pages. Gives you a sense of how much was going on. It's actually quite a bit bigger and more active in 1870. And gets even more so. Now, this isn't the mill building, and the building was destroyed in the fire in 1887. But this is one of those entrepreneurial activities that sprung up around all the mill projects. This is the American Patent Sponge Company. Now you may all wonder, what on earth would a sponge company be doing in Lebanon? They were making upholstery. Now, most of you didn't know that sponges were a local product. Well, they weren't. They came from the Bahamas. So they imported the sponges, brought them all the way up to Lebanon, made them into upholstery filler for sofas and settees, and sent them out. And of course, some of the local businesses around used their product for their paddings, for their furniture. And I'll get to some of that later. But this is, I think, an example of this entrepreneurial activity. People were trying all kinds of new things. Here are guys sorting the sponges in the factory building. And then let's talk about Kendrick and Davis, which is over on Water Street. And their first building was burned down. I'll show you a picture of the more recent one. But this is in the old building before the fire. They were making keys. Now, Kendrick was a jeweler, and he fixed watches. And then it came to mind that maybe he could fix those keys that watches, you wound your watches with. And so he has a 20 or 30 page booklet of products, these watch keys that they were selling. Now talk about entrepreneurial ideas. It's about as off base as the sponges. But at least we can understand how he got the idea for it. These are some of the watch keys he made. But it got more and more complicated. And then he started making tools for fixing watches. And they kept expanding. Just like Apple started with the Macintosh computer, and then we got laptops of some sort, and then we got iPhones and iPads and all these other things. Well, they're now really selling a phone more than a computer. Picture of Kendrick. Now, next door to Kendrick was a guy named Jesse Sturdivant, and his company got started about the same time Buck & Co. started in 1848, and they were making furniture. Now, I suspect, although I can't prove it, but I suspect, and I think more work would be productive in this area, but I think it demonstrates that he was using the sponges for his stuffings for some of his chairs and things. They sold a lot of furniture in the South. And one of the things you'll find, all of these big industries in Lebanon, they had an eye to exporting out of town. They weren't producing for the local market. That was easily absorbed. So they were trying to sell it around the country. And they had a four-story office block on Water Street, had a number of buildings. We often see these advertising cards. This is one for Sturdivant. After working for a number of years, he eventually started buying Buck Company's buildings and repurposing them for his products. And eventually he started investing in Kendrick and Davis's shop when they got started as well. But here's some of his furniture. There's Jesse. And they had shops on the lower part of town, which is below the current Mascoma Street. And then he had shops in the upper village, and he enlarged them by the 1880s, and larger still. I should go back, yeah. No, not that. And he had buildings on Water Street. So, like Buck, he had buildings in a number of places over along the river, on both sides of the river, I think. And this is the building that's actually important. This is where the fire in 1887 started. It's in one of Sturdivant's buildings. Sturdivant later sold out to a Boston company, Mead Company, and they took over his production later, but he was a major player in this entrepreneurial period after the Civil War. Now, I want to talk about size and edge tools, partly because they'll come into the later part of the story when we get to the mill parcel, which I want to talk about last. But size and edge tools were another product that was really, really important for Lebanon's growth and development. And how many of you know where Sideville is? I see 2 people, maybe 3. Well, Sideville is just west of downtown. Slayton Hill Road, that's Sideville, where the woolen shop is, right? Where Georgia Tuttle has her office, that's Sideville. And this is the old Sideville Bridge, and this is above the dam. And this is from below the dam. And there used to be several factories along there, all making edge tools, mostly scythes. Dutiel's, is it Dutiel's? The hardware store down there? Dulac, sorry. Dulac's Hardware, it didn't sound right. I'm going to start with a D. Dulac's Hardware was in one of the buildings for making saws in this period, in the post-Civil War period. This was one of Hildreth's and Sons. They had to have labels that they stuck onto their sides, and this is an example of one that I was able to get. And here's some of the workers. Now, one of the things that I'm not happy about with this talk, I'm mostly focusing on buildings and dams and mills and all of that, and not the people. But there are, of course, people behind all these things. There's a lot of workers in the buildings working on these things. And then there's the entrepreneurs who are putting together the capital to build these things. So here we get a few of the workers. And this is the old Sideville Dam with one of the mill buildings around it. So then, on May 10th, 1877, a fire started out in one of Sturdivant's buildings, and it swept through, destroyed 80 buildings. The loss was estimated, and this is from the New York Times, it was estimated at $300,000. In 1887, $300,000 was a lot of money. We're talking about millions of dollars worth of destruction today. Millions and millions. And here's some C.E. Lewis, our local photographer, most prominent local photographer, some of his photographs of the area that have been reprinted. And this is High Street over here. You can see just huge patch of town, including most of the old mills downtown. And you can see the dam, and all the mills around it are gone. And it was just tremendous destruction. This is a map that had drawn by Robert Levitt. It's hard to see from a distance press, but all these gray areas here are the buildings that were destroyed. The ones in black survived. Now, this means that most of the mills downtown were gutted and burnt to the ground. And of course, most of the mill buildings would have been made of wood. The river mill complex that was far enough away downriver, it wasn't affected. So it's very much like it was. And a little bit downriver, there's some of the buildings remained, but for the most part, everything was gone. And so people immediately started rebuilding. That's Lebanon. Same thing happened, of course, in '64. Anyway, The woolen mills rebuilt, and those that hadn't been destroyed expanded. And about the same time that Carter was getting started with this property and this enterprise, the woolen mills were starting to really take off in town in the late 80s, or the 1880s and so forth. And the fire just made labor cheap because there were a lot of employees that were wanting to work. And so they were able to build very quickly after that. And then these expanded. And here's Kendrick and Davis's new building. And this is the Mascoma Mill that was not affected by the fire. This is the River Mill complex. And the Riverside Mill here. And then about 1899, American Woolen Company, they owned more than 50 woolen mills in 8 different states. And 2 of them were here in Lebanon. There were 2 others in New Hampshire. And one was, this is from a 1921 brochure the American Woolen Company published. This is the Lebanon Mills. And then this is the Mascoma Mills, the River Mill complex today. So those persisted for quite a few years until the end of the 30s. And then American Woolen dumped them. They stopped being profitable. And they were bought out by Goldfine, and he was able to get them started up again for a few years, saved a few jobs, but then gradually that petered out. And then, of course, that butts up against the Depression. And of course, that had a tremendous effect and impact on the town of Lebanon. Now I want to shift, finally, my last segment, to the mill parcel. How many of you have been out to the mill parcel? Nicole was the one who actually put me onto this in the first place, and I thank her for that. Roger Carroll outlines the history of the mill parcel. It's located on Mill Road, down by the river, between the river and the rail trail. And Mill Road, which is opposite the intersection of 4 and 4A, opposite 4A, right? You just go down the hill. And this is the property that the city of Lebanon owns. And this red line here, this one is the remains of a foundation. I'll show you some slides of that in a minute. But it's a 5.3 acre lot on both sides of the river, north and west of the rail trail. It's owned by the city. It's administered by the Conservation Commission. And when Nicole was chairing the Conservation Commission, that's when she put me onto this. It happens one of my colleagues at Franklin Pierce University, where I currently teach, Bob Goodby, is an archaeologist. He was asked to do a quick and dirty survey of the site. And that also put me onto it as well. And so I'm going to use some of his images. But this is from East Lebanon. This is where it's located. And you see it's right along the railroad. Now, being along the railroad was, of course, important because it allowed them to ship their product out that way. And here's a National Geographic's map of the same site. And we actually have a bunch of photographs of this mill site at various times. But according to Roger Carroll's story, it was first a slate mill. And you may all wonder, what on earth is a slate mill? And then it was an edge tool mill. And then it was a bobbin mill. And those are all true, but that doesn't quite tell the whole story. It's a much more complicated story. And I think a lot of these mill sites along the river have similarly complicated stories. Here you can see a bit of the foundation. There's some trees growing in amongst the foundation, but they would have had buildings built on top of that. And it was originally a slate mill, and Elijah Liscombe, who was one of the early postmasters in Lebanon, lived downtown, but he owned property over there, and he found slate on his property. And so he decided to turn this into a mill. And so he incorporated, and as the Lebanon Slate Company, I believe it was, and it was incorporated. I've seen the original papers, and he had a variety of other investors. It didn't run for very long, 3 or 4 years, But it happened to be over, we actually know that he had about 5 men and 5 women employed in 1870 because there was an industrial census done at the time. We know how much capital he made, and he made slate flour. Now, I don't know about any of you, but I didn't know anything about slate flour. But it's used to make tiles. You put some sort of fixer in, and it becomes a tile. And so here's an example from one of the museums in Granville, New York, where they do the same sort of thing. Well, it didn't take long for this site to, here's the path down from the mill road. There's some barriers to keep pedestrian and bicycle only. And here's one of the new kiosks there. Steps down to the river. And it's built right along the river there because it was using water power. There are a few slate outcrops that you can still see in the area. And, but getting to the slate mill in the old days required going across the river by a covered bridge, and this is the covered bridge there. And here's some more of the foundation. Well, this is part of the abutment for that covered bridge. And I think the dam was not far from the covered bridge, although I don't know exactly where it was. But it must have been at least 15 feet high, so it carried a lot of water behind it. There's still evidence of the mill race right on the site. So if any of you have a chance to go look at it in nicer weather, warmer weather, you can still see evidence of the mill race there. And here's a part of the foundation. Now, we don't know which of this foundation is original to the first mill formation. Lots of this kind of stone around. And here we see the covered bridge, and I think there's part of the dam right there close by the bridge. Now, it operated until 1875 when the vein petered out and the assets were sold at auction. And it sold off 81 acres, and the company retained the mill site itself, the part that Lebanon currently owns. And it was sold to Albro V. Emerson, who was making size over at Sideville. He and his family were over there, and they moved over to East Lebanon and started this up. No longer as a slate mill, now they were making edge tools, size. He went into partnership with Dewey from Dewey Mills over in Vermont. And in fact, there's Dartmouth has the Dewey's papers, and they have some of the Emerson Edge Tool Company receipts and letterheads and things like that, because they were in Tassville, Vermont. And so, now in 1876, the mill site was sold to Captain Gordon, who intended to use it as a paper mill, but that never came to pass, and I haven't been able to find evidence that it was actually sold to him, but it was reported in the newspaper. Then it was sold to Nathan Crosby in Lowell, Mass., another mill town, and then it was sold back to Elijah Liscombe, so I don't know that ever went anywhere. And there was some, it looks like Nathan Crosby did buy some lots in East Lebanon, but it's not clear that he ever did anything with it. Eventually it was sold then to Albro Emerson, who turned it into an edge tool company. He was also born in New Hampshire, but over in Newport. He worked for various companies, the A.V. Emerson and Company over in Sideville, Emerson and Cummings. He later sold his interest to Cummings, and it became J. Cummings and Company. And he ran it for a while. He worked for Dewey for a while. People had very complicated work histories. And he brought back the company in '66, and the firm became Emerson and Company. And eventually it became sold to Cummings and Pourmort, and then became Mascoma Edge Tool Company. And then he's fully over here on this side of town. So really, these people were moving and buying and selling. There's a lot of deal making going on. This is when he gets involved with A.G. Dewey at Tassville. And here's some of the letterhead, early payroll sheets. hired a lot of people, both here and in Tassville. But he moved the firm to East Lebanon in '82. He expanded the factory buildings. I think he added some more of the foundation. And so it's a bigger factory building. And of course, it was right along the railroad, so they could get their size out of town. And again, it's very, very important that it's close to both the railroad and the river. And he had price lists and gave you some sense of the kinds of things he was selling. Some of his men, we actually do know the names of these guys because we happen to have a photograph of all these guys and their names are identified. That's one of the problems with doing research in these early mills. If you see photographs of the workers, you don't know who they are, and it's too long ago to be able to identify them. We do, however, know about the Emerson Edge tool cat named Dick. And again, the covered bridge over the river. And you can see that this is, I think, where the dam is, and I think the mill race is going through there. So it's a pretty big factory out in the middle of nowhere today. But then, when he died in '93, his son Frank took over the business, and he started making axes in addition to size. And eventually, he got tired, and so they sold some of the rights to the river to the Mascoma River Improvement Company, which owned a lot of water power in the area. But they reserved the rights to side-making efforts for themselves so that nobody could compete with them. There's a no-compete clause. And Frank and his sister sold the property to a New York buyer in 1907. And then eventually, by 1908, it was sold to Edmund Hambleton and Joel Seidenbaum. Now, Hambleton came from Goffstown. He had been busy over there making bobbins. And I think they're just blocking out very rough bobbins is what they were doing. And they started making those here, except the first year of operation, the factory burns down. Yet another fire. We actually have a photograph that I took, or Bob Goodby took, of one of the foundations that was built in 1909 as a concrete foundation. It's probably a brick covered with concrete. And you can even see October 1909 written in the side. So we know when it was started up again. And so they operated it from 1909 as a bobbin factory. And then it became less viable to operate over there. So they moved the shop over here to Mahan Flat, down over on Spencer Street. And those of you who know town may know the Emerson Gardens apartments. Well, they're not called Emerson Gardens anymore, but they were originally. Well, that site was the Emerson Gardens. It was a greenhouse. Now, it's not Albro Emerson's family. It's another Emerson family. But the property right next door was where Hambleton moved the factory to make bobbins. And now we're talking about the 20s, and by the 30s, that business is really going bust. And I found the deed when it was sold back to the city, or sold at auction, to pay for the taxes for that property for $46. So that's the sort of story of a lot of businesses in Lebanon. The devastation of the Depression was real here. Anyway, this is, I think, a bobbin factory period photo from the same site up on the mill parcel. And then, of course, John Gunnarson had bought options to the water rights. See, these things were very complicated. And the options ran out without him taking up any of them. And then Carter and Rogers, who owned the Everett Knitting Mill, later the Lebanon Woolen Mill, later the American Woolen Mill, they got involved. And this is when Hamilton in 1919 moved it off to Mahan Flat. Anyway, so the point here is that Lebanon's history is a complicated one, and if you look at any one property, you're going to see a very, very cumbersome and complicated history. And even on the most stable of properties, they're going to have a very complicated history. This one indeed has a complicated history as well. But without the entrepreneurial spirit that I think is common in Lebanon from the very early days, from the early 1800s to the present, I don't think we'd have what we have. But we really needed the Mascoma River to keep things going and moving. So with that, I'll stop and I'd entertain questions if you have any. Thanks. Yeah.
Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more about the railroad and its effect on the town, and when did it
Well, the
start
railroad
out,
was-
what caused its demise, and when did that happen?
Well, I can't speak to what caused the railroad's demise, but the railroad was absolutely essential to getting product in and out of town. Of course, there's another feature that I haven't mentioned, because it's a much more recent history, and looking at the average age of the crowd, most of us will remember when the interstate highways were being constructed, right? Yeah, yeah. Well, the interstate highway that Lane Dwinell was able to arrange to come through Lebanon, it saved the town from having Claremont's fate, right? Claremont people were very happy that the highway had gone through Lebanon instead of Claremont, and of course it killed the town. And Lane Dwinell not only got an exit to the interstate, but he got 4 exits to the interstate. Right? 17, 18, 19, and 20. So that, I think, is one of the things that it was the Eisenhower effort to build an interstate highway system and subsidies to the trucking industry that basically put paid to the kind of railroad traffic that we used to have. But I don't know the local story because I haven't studied that part of local history. Yeah.
The Excelsior Mill.
Yeah.
You didn't mention it. It was out.
Oh, there's lots of other mills around that I didn't mention.
Is that the same area where the slate mill?
No, it's over here on
I know
Bank
where it
Street
is.
Extension,
No, I know
over
where
where
it
the ServPro building is.
I know
Yeah.
exactly where it is because Roger Wood owned it. He was the heir of Kendrick Davis. And he owned it and then created an apartment out of some of the old apartments by the river.
Well, those houses in those two, Jefferson Circle, and there's another circle over there off of Bank Street Extension. Those used to be fields that held all the Excelsior. And Excelsior, for some of the younger people in the audience, is shaved wood that was used to pack things with. Before we had styrofoam bubble with peanuts,
Excelsior was much better.
Excelsior was what was used. And so you needed, and we had a lot of wood in the area, so they ground up shaved wood. And they had big bins of it for more than a couple of acres of that. And that's over on Bank Street Extension, on the south side of the extension. Wow.
Some of us in this room were here in 1963 when a fire came, probably well after much of Lebanon had disappeared from the mill scene. But what were the changes that resulted from that fire? What went out?
Well, the big thing was they changed the direction, or they changed Hanover Street. Now, Hanover Street, of course, at 64, I wasn't here then, but in 64, had the interstate come through yet?
No.
Okay, so Hanover Street went straight up, right? But it went through from this street right outside here, Park Street, it went up between Salt Hill and Three Tomatoes, and it went up and joined what is now Hanover Street, through the mall.
Yeah, it went right up to the high school.
Yeah. But they changed that completely. They were able to save the buildings on this end of the fire, but it hit rather mostly the same area that was hit in 1887. And it's a very big devastation, but not quite as big as the one in 87.
Were any of the mills still going? And the tannery was still here, wasn't it?
It was for a while.
It was here for long.
Yeah.
And both these shops.
Yeah.
I mean, we came in 1960 and there was one mill working still, and the tannery, and both the shops. So this one and the lower shop.
Yeah. So. Yeah.
When was the last water power that go out?
The last water power for
For the mills?
well, it was still used, and I think there's still some electric power being created from water power, particularly downstream. 1964 fire actually did away with most of these mills. If you read Robert Levitt's book, Robert Levitt.
Oh, really? Okay.
If you look at his book, and he goes street by street and section by section, the photographs tend to be toward the later end when all the mills are decaying and the dams are decaying. And there's a picture of this dam just before it was destroyed. I spent quite a few hours last week looking at this book, and one of the things is you get a sense of the demise of the dams. And of course, without the dams, you can't have the mills, at least the mill power. So that was happening in the 60s and 70s primarily. And but it had been going on. The dams decay naturally through time, and then they get torn out. But I think the 40s is when most of the mill power generation from the river really disappears. And I think it's a leftover from the Depression. The Depression really knocks everything hard, and then it just goes into disrepair, and it basically starts getting torn down. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm from Orford, and in Orford there's an iron road sign, as many towns have around, and on the back of it says Lebanon Ironworks, I think.
Yeah, that was over.
And where was that?
They were over in the area that was burned in the first fire. Yeah.
The first
in
fire?
87, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. It's the one right there, end of Bridge Street.
Yeah. No, and there are other places in
Yeah.
New Hampshire that have that.
Right.
Yeah.
When did the railroad come to Lebanon?
Well, it had to be before 1860 because it appears on the maps, and I think it was in the 1850s, probably on the early side of that. But I don't know if you know.
What's that?
When did the railroad come to Lebanon?
1849.
Oh, 49, okay. Which may have something to do with when Buck and company come into town and Sturtevant gets started. Because as soon as you have rail travel possible, you can ship these bulky things out. I mean, you can imagine this tendener, for example. You don't just ship that out by wagon, you know? And of course, they were located relatively close to the railroad station. So, I think that's central there. Yes?
It sounds to me like if you took a number of people around in this room, you would have more research, more data as you came out here, but actually people up there firsthand, that have been here, I think going on, at least in the recent times.
Yeah, certainly on the recent end. I really was focusing primarily on the 19th century side of it. And my real interest was to use the mill parcel got me interested in this topic. And then I realized the mill parcel is in microcosm what was going on across town. Very complex industrial histories.
It would just make the job of the next person that does about Lebanon, the job, if you took all the people here talking about it, they will be researching, this will be ancient history.
Absolutely. Yes.
Would you just explain again about this slate mill? Can you still get to it? You said.
Yeah, go down to follow Route 4, get off at exit 17, going toward Enfield, and follow Route 4. And one of the first major intersections there is 4A will veer off to your right. But before you get there, just right at that intersection, on the left-hand side of the road is Mill Road. And you can park at the top of Mill Road and park there and then walk down. But don't go this time of year with the snow. It's not very safe. I don't have a problem with you going if you had snowshoes or something or appropriate snowwear, but this is not the time to go. Summer is really good. And be careful in the spring because the high river water is a problem too. So you want to wait for the spring rains to have gone through and then you can get to it. Although Nicole, who was here earlier, she can certainly tell. She's been overall every inch of that property. So, well, thank you so much.
I want to thank you, Robert, for this wonderful talk, and I have one question.
Okay.
Now, this wonderful building that was the H.W. Carter and Sons factory closed in 1985, and it had been functioning for a number of years. How many other mills have that kind of longevity?
Well, even the River Mill complex, the Mascoma Mill, was started in 1882, and it functioned into the 30s, but that's not as long.
And it keeps going.
Yeah, exactly. And this building, I had talked about this building and its history in past talks, so I decided tonight I wasn't going to give any focus to this. I wanted to talk about other things that interested me. So I purposely didn't talk about this building because you've had a series of lectures that have addressed it. But it's a really important question. And even when the Carter factory closed up, it was used for commercial purposes for a number of years after that. And then AVA came in.
And we are determined to keep it going.
And AVA, of course, has been a major social center for the town of Lebanon.
Excuse me, I didn't interrupt.
And I think it's really become a place, a meeting place for all kinds of different crowds for various events, and I think it's really wonderful.
I was surprised, when did they take down the lower shop, the Carter Churchill shop that was down?
In the 90s?
I wasn't in town yet. Ed, you know?
Remember when that was?
2002, I think.
Oh, really?
2001 or 2.
2001 or 2, John?
And they built it.
Huh? Where it's Spencer Square now, but the railroad station, it seems to me the railroad station and the lower shop went about at the same time, but I just don't remember when that was.
Well, when I came to town, it was all gone. And that was in 2000, so I was
Okay, so
before
maybe
that, but it may not have been much before that.
But may I also acknowledge another distinguished presence in the audience today, and that's Stephanie Jackson. His photograph is here. Here she is together with her brother Gordon. And her father Frank and Uncle Stanley were the last owners and managers, up until 1965. And 1967. And you're busy writing the history of the Carter family and the Jackson family. And we can't wait to have you talk here.